Welcome back to the first of the practical video tutorials on Sequence Generator Pro. I now have some clear skies so we can actually get a sequence up and running. I'm going to power up Sequence Generator Pro and bring in a sequence that I have put together but not tried out yet. This sequence is looking at a star cluster called Caroline's Rose, which was discovered by Caroline Herschel. Now, I've already set up what I think is the correct equipment for the camera, the focuser, the telescope and so on. But I haven't yet accurately set the target center, so I need to do that, and I also don't know if my focus position is in the right area. So what I'm going to first of all do is connect the camera and the filter wheel, and then the focuser, telescope driver, take a few seconds, and then I'm going to connect my roof, the safety monitor and a weather monitor. Now that's one way of connecting them all. Another way is to do Tools, Connect All Equipment, and that will additionally connect the PhD2 auto guider system, which I'm not using right just at this moment. But as soon as it does that, it uses the settings in the control panel, which is part of the... Come on, wakey wakey. There we go. So it's now cooling down when the camera connects, and it will warm up when the sequence completes. So if I click to the temperature tab here, you'll see it has started to cool, and it's going to cool to -15 in 45 minutes, which shouldn't steam it up at all. So while it's cooling down, my light levels are fairly modest. I'm in the middle of twilight at the moment, so I have a system which gives me graphs for light level. So it's just starting to get dark, and thankfully there's no cloud, no rain, and the wind is minimal. So I'll just minimize that for a second. And what I'm first of all going to do is slew to the general area of the cluster, and I'm going to check the rough focus. So one way to slew is simply to do this and do slew now. But on this particular telescope, I first of all need to check that it's not parked. So I'll just quickly do that and hit unpark. And now if I do slew, it should slew. If I click on the Sky X, it'll start to move into position. And the particular cluster I'm after is just before the meridian. So with a bit of luck, it'll be clear enough to examine how the meridian flip works as the target crosses the meridian setting. So we'll let that slew into position, and let's go back to Sequence Generator Pro. So I can close that for a second, and what I'm going to do is look at the focus. And to do the focus, I'm going to use the Frame of Focus tab up here and the manual focus controls here. I'm not going to run autofocus at this stage because SGP really likes you to be somewhere close to focus for its focus routine to work the best. So I'm just simply going to take a quick image. A couple of seconds should be sufficient. So when that downloads, we will get a very dark picture with a few white dots. Okay, and not to disappoint, I'm going to hit Auto Stretch up here and then right click and do Auto Stretch Medium. So I have some stars and they look to be in reasonable focus. So what I'm going to do is use a subframe and draw it around one of these little stars, and I'm going to do continuous. And what this will do is it'll just take an image and download just that little patch and put that star in the middle. So what I can now do is set a set of steps and say 20 steps in and see if the star gets bigger or smaller. Not much difference. Let's just try a bit more. We're at a very high magnification here, over 300%. That seems to be a little bit bigger. We could be seeing noise at this point in time. I'm going to move out 50 steps and see what happens. I think that focus is about right. So what I'm going to do is just hit an autofocus. So I'm going to hit stop here, and then hit autofocus. But before doing that, I'm just going to check the settings. So I now have autofocus set for every 0.6 degree centigrade change. It's going to focus on a filter change before the sequence start. There's going to be 9 data points, 30 steps apart, and it's going to... I've disabled smart focus because this telescope has a central obstruction, and I'm going to crop the focus frames to get rid of the nasties around the edge, and I don't care about dark subtraction. So I'm going to hit run. This may or may not work because I've got the subframe connected. I can't do anything whilst the autofocus is running. So if the autofocus turns up with a very tiny picture, I will know for next time, oh, it's okay, it didn't use the subframe. So while autofocus is running, I'm going to pause the video and come back to it in a little while. So a half flux radius of 6 is not in focus, and it should be around the 2 level for this particular telescope. So the indications are it's going in the right direction. So after about 3, if the trend is still downwards, we're good. Yep, that's good. So one thing to watch out for, if I just move this out of the way, is you're looking for the autofocus routine to give you at least 20 or 30 stars. These little circles are highlighting the stars it's detected, the maximum intensity in the middle, and the half flux radius. And this white border is the area that it's using for its calculation. The stuff around the margins is ignored. And the way that this autofocus routine works in the most modern versions of SGP is it does a curve fit rather than a V fit, which when you're close to focus is more accurate because you do not get a perfect V. So when you run the autofocus routine manually, it does not close the dialog box down so you can see what's actually happened, and it's done a curve fit to this array of points. So in actual fact I was very close to the actual focus position. So I can now close this, and it's now set the temperature and the focus position, so if that temperature continues to fall, it'll trigger an autofocus when the sequence is running. So the next thing to do is look at our composition. I'm just going to remove these stars for a second and take in a fresh frame. I'm going to bring in about 10 seconds, 2 by 2, and take an image. I need to take the subframe off and try again. So what I'm going to do here is, although I'm in the rough position, what I'm going to do is take an image and then decide exactly where I want to put it. And I'm going to use another feature of Sequence Generator Pro, which is very handy. So if you can see, there's a cluster here, but it's offset from the middle. So I'm going to right click this and do plate solve. Now when it plate solves it, it will come and give me some coordinates. I don't necessarily at this point in time want to use it for the target because it's wrong. I'm just going to hit OK, and I want to center it here, so I'm going to right click on the screen here and do center here. So what it now does is it knows what the plate solved coordinates are of the image, it knows how much to move the telescope, so it's going to take a picture, it's going to move the telescope, it's going to take another picture, plate solve it and validate it, and so hopefully the next picture I have will be smack in the middle. So it's 200 pixels off at the moment, so it's going to do a second round until the error is below about 20 pixels. If you have a rotator, it'll also give you rotation angle changes as well. So I'm now 2 pixels, just 2 pixels off, which is pretty good. So I hit done, and now the cluster is in the middle, and I can now right click that, plate solve it, which should take very little time at all, and I'm going to use that as the coordinates for my target. So if I look at my target, it now has updated coordinates for the center of the cluster. It's going to slew and center on location when the sequence starts up, and it also has start and stop times, which at the moment are set for the same time. So I need to look at the planning tools. So I'm just going to move this up here because the planning tools appear at the bottom. So you can see a little green circle and a red cross, which represent the start and stop times. To set the stop time, you right click. So I'm going to right click here, and I'm going to set a start time up here. And you can see the transit time is around here. So these times are now populated back into here with the altitudes. You can equally alter the altitudes and it will alter the start and stop time. So if you, for instance, wanted 60 degrees, you can type that in here and it now changes the time until it's 60 degrees. If you're outside of the correct times, in other words, you're in twilight or dawn, it'll give you a warning. So there's a little exclamation mark here and it says target start time is during daylight. So I need to back off a little bit and left click around here somewhere. There we go. So that means I'm now imaging in darkness. On the planning tool, there's also some information about the moon phase and rise and set times. So I can hit OK for that and OK for that. So what we have now is something that's roughly in focus. We know precisely where we want to stick it. What we haven't done is worked out the generic exposure. So at the moment, if I just remove that out of the way, I've guessed the exposure is 120 seconds from experience. But what we need to do is check that out. So what I'm going to do is select 1x1 binning. I'm going to make sure it's the UV-IR filter, hit 120 seconds and hit take 1. And I'll come back when the exposure is complete. So now that the exposure is complete, it is put it on the screen, and what we're looking at is what the peak exposure is. So if I click on image statistics, I have clipped at 65,000, but you can't really tell because the screen is stretched. So if I right click here and say auto stretch none, we now are able to see what stars are clipped, and it's literally just a few white dots. If I move up to 50%, it's not exactly overkill. There's just this one star that's maxed out. So my 2-minute exposure is probably about right. And in fairness, I could probably do more, probably about 3 minutes without any real problems. The only thing is, if you look at the sequence, there are a number of default times that you can use. Now, you can type in any time you like in this box, but what I've typically done in the past is use these default times for all my dark frames. So I try where possible to use these times, and it means I don't need to create a unique set of dark frames. So I'm going to leave it at 2 minutes per exposure. And just before I set it in stone, check one little thing, which is that the camera's gain is correct. Now, with CMOS cameras, they have variable gain. I mean, all cameras have variable gain, but CMOS cameras especially have gain and offset, and it can be many, many values. And hitting the spanner tool brings up what the gain and offset is for this particular CMOS camera. And you can have any value. And each value would need a unique dark frame setting and bias frame setting. So what I'm going to do is set up a number of defaults, and I've already done this before. So I've set up one for stars at low gain, one for deep sky objects at high gain, and one in the middle for planetary imaging. So if I set stars, that's exactly where I was before, so I have got the right level for this particular object. If this was a nebula, I would use the deep sky object one, which is a much higher gain and an offset so that we don't get black pixels. So let's put that back to stars and hit OK. So I think we're good to go, and we can simply hit run when we get to the point of it being dark enough. So just before we do that, there's one other thing we need to do, and that is to check if our calibration system is also true for the guider. So if I just close that for a second and bring up PhD2, there are other guiders, but this is the one that I typically use. And if I just check that I've got everything here, so this is the wrong equipment profile, it would normally be this one. Now here's something else to check. Equipment profiles are triggered also by Sequence Generator Pro. So if I just close that for a second and go into my control panel and do auto guide and then do settings, what should happen is it's picking up this one here, which is particular to my equipment profile. And if I click on my PhD2 thing here and click on that, so it's now showing the correct profile here with a ZWO camera for the guider and the SkyX autoguider input. So I can close that for a second and know that that's going to work. The other thing just to check here is I already have a stored calibration for the guider. This is permanently fixed to the telescope. If you didn't, you would need to go and slew off and manually set up the guider calibration settings. I've stored it through the brain setting here, where if you look at guiding, it says auto restore calibration. If that was unchecked, every time you boot up PhD2 you would need to calibrate the guider. Because I'm using a permanent observatory, this is something that's quite easy to do, but if you're using a mobile observatory, then you need to think a little bit about either keeping the camera in a predefined position very accurately, or again calibrating each time you use it. So if I just minimize that for a second and bring up the sequencer, we're all set. We have our target, we have our exposure, we have our rough focus already set up. So all I need to do now is hit run sequence, and it'll wait until 1737 to start the program. So hit run sequence and close this down, and you can see it says waiting till 1737 to start Caroline's Rose. So I'm going to come back in about 20 minutes and we'll see what it does when it starts up. So initially it slews to the target, that should be pretty close already, and it then starts the autofocus routine. So this will happen even though the camera hasn't yet reached its lowest operating temperature, and it'll continue to do all these activities with the camera not at temperature until it actually starts the imaging sequence itself. And in which case, if it hasn't got within about a degree, it'll ask you what you want to do, whether to continue or to pause and wait for it to achieve the right temperature. So for the moment, I'm just going to pause this video and come back for when it's pretty much focused. So the autofocus is almost completed. It's now forming a much better response. That's partly because of the telescope optics have now cooled down and the mirrors performing better, and also because the seeing noise has probably got better as well. So once it's completed 100%, it takes a validation exposure just to make sure that it has found the right focus, and when it does that, it'll close, and it's closing in about 3 seconds, as you can see up here. So the clever thing that the recent versions of SGP do is it tries not to plate solve before the focus has been completed. In the early versions it used to accurately center, then focus. Now it slews, focuses and then centers. So it's now taking a reference frame, it's going to plate solve and accurately settle within a few pixels of where I want it to be. And now it's within a few pixels and it's good to go. So what we now do is it moves on automatically. I'm not touching anything, and it says at the bottom it's resuming the auto guider. And if I double click PhD2 down here and bring up the screen, you can see it's picked up a star and it's now going to try and guide it. So it's auto selected, it does this all on its own, and using the built-in calibration that was done earlier, it's now guiding. So if I just minimize that and minimize that, when you click on the PhD2 graph here, the guider trace that is in this thing here is repeated here. If you click on this graph, it changes the sensitivity of the scale, so that's a very sensitive scale, and that's something in the middle. So when it's actually achieved the right level of settling, which was defined, if you recall, back in the control panel. I'm running this remotely, so sometimes there's a bit of a lag between me hitting buttons and things working. So under plate solve and auto guide, if I look at auto guide, it waits for a settle of 2 pixels for a second. I'm going to actually increase that because I'm running at a very small scale at the moment, so I'll make it 3 pixels, which is probably a more sensible choice. And it's now, if you notice at the bottom here, it says waiting for temperature to reach the cooling temperature. So I'm still a few degrees away, so I just need to wait for that to occur. Welcome back. We've now reached temperature on the camera, and we've started the first of the images in the sequence a little bit later than designed. We had a cloud come over and I had to abort, so what we've had to do is start again, but unfortunately if I look at the Sky X, I'm now past the meridian, so I can't demonstrate a meridian flip on this particular target at the moment, and we'll have to wait for another day or choose a different target. So let's just minimize that for a second. So each time it reaches the end of here, the sequence count here, a progress bar, increments up, and I'll show you a couple of little tricks you can do as you go along. So for instance, along here is the image history of a number of different targets, and you can see the number of stars and the radius of the stars themselves, which gives an indication whether the focus is going out. So this is an old one which I need to clear out, so I'm just going to move that out of the way and hit this little button here and do clear all. So when this comes in, we'll start to see a history of star size and count. The other thing to note is that if you get an image come through and it doesn't look very good, you can actually decide to discount it. So once this downloads, if I didn't like it, there's a thumbs down button here, and it says mark it as bad, so it renames the file with a bad prefix, and I can decrement the event counter. Now at the moment, if I just shut that for a second and look at here, the event counter shows 1, but if I mark this as bad, it's now gone to 0. So you don't lose anything at the end of the day when you've realised you've had to delete 5 frames and forgot to account for them. So I'm going to leave that running. The little thumbs down logo has been put on the image, and this will carry on going until the early hours of tomorrow morning. So thank you for watching, and I'll do a separate video on meridian flips.